stay away from everybody for 24 hours. Like all this quarantining stuff that we read about in the Old Testament. And on one hand, for thousands of years, everyone, the smartest people on earth thought, well, the Jews are just weird and that's just some weird spiritual thing. But then we realize now, just over the last couple hundred years, it hasn't been that long, that all of a sudden humans are like, oh, we should wash things. Like if a dead animal falls into a pot, there's an actual commandment in the Old Testament. If a dead animal falls into a pot, if it's like a porous thing, you have to break it and you don't eat out of that dish anymore. But if it's like a metal thing, you basically pass it through a fire, sanitize, sterilize it, and then you can cook out of it again. People thought that was just a weird religious thing, like God was just asking people to jump through hoops just for the sake of being mean. But now you realize, like, well, yeah, cool. you should probably sanitize something if a squirrel falls into your pot. Like, probably just don't dump the squirrel out and eat out of it, which is what people have done for thousands of years. And so there's so many times in the Bible where I think even things that may not make sense to us today, like we'll look at something and be like, why does God say I can't do that or I shouldn't do that or what? We may not even understand it today, but we also, 200 years ago we didn't even understand we should wash our hands.
Right.
But if we had just done it God's way, how many people would have lived? How many people would have survived?
All I know is I'm going to go home and boil all my pots.
Exactly. But we do that now.
All the dead animals in your cabinet, right?
But we do that now. Like now that's just part of our culture.
Yeah.
So many of the commandments we take for granted, but there's things God said to do, and if we were 4,000 years ago when he first said these things, these were revolutionary. Mm-hmm. It talks about like if you use the restroom outside, like bury it, like stuff like that. Where we're like, that's ridiculous, but at the same time, like, yeah, that's what people do now. Like we have septic tanks, like that's how we prevent diseases and stuff. And in countries and cultures where they don't do that, everyone gets cholera and dies. It's not a good thing. So a lot of times the commandments, it seems really weird because we think of like everything should be this weird high and lofty holiness thing that only applies for the afterlife. But oftentimes like the advice is just don't lie. If someone borrows something from you, give it to them. If someone just basic human interaction stuff, building codes. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in the Old Testament especially that to us seems really dumb. But at the same time, if you think about it, like that's good advice. Maybe I should put a fence around the balcony. Like there's a verse in there about if you have a balcony, put a fence around it because you don't want people to fall off the roof. Like these are just building codes that nowadays.
Well, that's stupid having the Bible.
Yeah, but we do it. But so the Bible isn't always like this mystical, magical thing. A lot of times it's just good advice.
Exactly. He
and
made
so why
the world,
wouldn't
and then
we
he
do
gave
it?
us people who wrote the different books in the Bible. He gave us rules.
And why wouldn't we? And depending on the circumstances, there's times in the Bible where like they're setting up, when the Israelites come out of Egypt, they are setting up government. So it tells them how to set up their judges, how to set up essentially their politicians. It tells them how to
pay to Caesar what Caesar.
Yeah, it tells them how to do their taxes essentially, their offerings to the temple. It tells them how to take care of the poor. It tells them their building codes. It tells them all this extra stuff, which to us we may not necessarily need or be able to apply because we don't have a military that is a Christian military or anything like that. But there's all sorts of things in there that are still principles that we can learn from, and they're all for our good. Every single commandment of God is not going to make our lives worse. So why wouldn't we? It's kind of my perspective. So
Very good.
I want us to take just a little break so people can get coffee, and then when we come back, if you would, I would love for you to talk about the 7 holidays that you celebrate.
Okay.
And the implications, not implications, but the, what am I trying to say? What's the word? Like, for example, when I went to the display that came around of the tabernacle that they had to do.
Yeah, we saw that one. It was north of here,
awesome.
Long
Yeah,
Hollow.
it was in Long Hollow Pike. I don't know how many of y'all have done a study before. I did it one time with my small group on the tabernacle, but the little
Beth Moore.
she's gone. Yeah, the little parts or big parts, all the sections of the tabernacle and what was done in each section has a New Testament Jesus implication that most people, when they're reading about it in the Old Testament, don't get that.
Right.
For example, when the curtain was rent, the veil was rent from top to bottom. What does that represent? What?
The
What
church.
was it? Huh?
I said the church.
It represents Christ dying on the cross and completely removing the veil that separated, or we felt like separated us from Him and gave us direct access to God. We no longer,
And the fact that it came from the top to the bottom, it was God.
There's so many things
it's
like
God bringing it down.
That's what I love is like when you take the whole Bible into perspective, Old Testament, New Testament, all that. Like you start to connect all these dots. And even then when you start to understand the culture and the context that these things were given in. So even in that, like the tabernacle and temple, like that's my new thing.
Yeah.
But like, so the veil, it was actually, Josephus talks about it, the historian, and that veil was actually called the heavens because it was embroidered with like all sorts of stars and different things. And so then when you read back in the prophets, when it's talking about the redemption of God's people, and it says, "Oh Lord, that you would rend the heavens and that your glory would come down," and all this stuff. It was actually like, in addition to everything else, like they literally tore the heavens open. Same thing that you see when Christ was first baptized by John the Baptist. The heavens were tore open and the dove came down. It's the same thing. It's this tearing of the heavens and the descension of the power of God, and like, so it's all these little dots.
It's so exciting because I think as Christians a lot of times we love to focus on the New Testament because that seems applicable and it seems more easy to understand because it's Jesus. But we can't, we in here don't. Most Christians I know don't separate Old Testament from New Testament. It's just the Old Testament is more historical. I hate history. I'm just going to be. I'm going to confess. I couldn't stand history in high school. I did what I had to do to get through it, barely with a C. I couldn't tell you now when most wars were fought, who they were fought with.
Who cares?
I don't care. But the Old Testament is so rich, and when you read the Old Testament and you start to understand, like with these celebrations, these holidays, when John and his dad were going over them before, it was like, oh my gosh, I mean, I couldn't write fast enough. All the different parts of the celebration, what they represented, and then realizing how that applies to us today was so super exciting. That being said, if the tabernacle display ever comes back, don't miss it, because I literally felt like I was living in the Old Testament. It was awesome, an awesome display. So let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back.
This is so good. Thank